The creation of a new capital city in the Sahara Desert, east of Cairo, exemplifies Egypt's ambitious vision for modernization and urbanization. With the current capital suffering challenges such as congestion and overpopulation, the new administrative hub aims to address these issues by providing a fresh start in a strategically chosen site. This audacious project shows the government's determination to build a modern, efficient, and sustainable city capable of housing millions of people while also functioning as a hub for government activities and international relations. The city is now known as the new administrative capital, but its formal name has yet to be selected. However, its importance as a future hub of governance, business, and diplomacy is apparent. The new capital intends to simplify administrative duties and boost diplomatic engagement by relocating all government offices and personnel from Cairo and urging foreign embassies to do the same. When completed, the city is expected to contain 6.5 million people, making it one of the largest urban settlements built in the 21st century, signifying Egypt's commitment to embrace development and transform its national environment. The envisioned magnificence of the new capital city in the Sahara Desert contrasts with its current reality of emptiness and financial duress. Despite initial forecasts of completion in 2022 at a cost of $45 billion, the project has fallen severely behind schedule and is currently anticipated to have cost more than $58 billion for only Phase 1, marking a whopping $13 billion overrun. This overrun is due to a variety of issues, including ambitious architectural ideas, bureaucratic inefficiency, and unexpected building obstacles. While a few government ministries have relocated to the new capital, the planned mass relocation of foreign embassies has failed to occur, leaving the city virtually bereft of the international diplomatic presence that was previously envisaged. The project's grandeur and richness, as seen by extravagant architectural designs and the establishment of many districts serving varied purposes, have contributed to a longer construction timeframe and rising prices. One such district is the Government District, which was designed to serve as the Egyptian state's nerve center, rising from the desert sands as a testament to the project's ambitious ambition despite the hurdles and setbacks faced along the way. In 2021, it was raised to a height of 207 meters, 680 feet, making it taller than the Washington Monument in D.C. The flag it flies is roughly the same size as two standard basketball courts placed side by side. To the north of this sprawling government district, another district is dedicated to housing the new presidential palace complex, which will become Egypt's new home residence. When completed, this area will house the new headquarters for 34 Egyptian government departments, as well as the country's two chambers of parliament, the House of Representatives and Senate. This government zone, at 550 acres, will be around 80% larger than the National Mall in America's capital, Washington, D.C., and will feature numerous more imposing buildings, including the world's tallest flagpole. The edifice that houses the presidential palace is immense, with around 50,000 square meters of total floor space, which is almost 10 times larger than the White House in Washington, D.C., which serves as the American president's residence. And smuggled photographs from inside the Egyptian palace show what appears to be an exquisite throne chamber covered with real gold, similar to the sumptuous palaces of Islamic sultans from centuries ago. The walls that surround the royal complex would eventually comprise a series of gardens spanning an estate of more than 2 square kilometers in size. That is about 4 times the size of the walled-off Vatican City, which is home to the Pope. The new presidential palace complex alone is said to have cost the Egyptian government over $3 billion to build, putting it on a par with Buckingham Palace in London in terms of magnificence. That is the British monarch's house, and appraisers have independently evaluated it at around $5 billion. Egypt's new Islamic Cultural Center, also known as the Egyptian Grand Mosque, is located at the opposite southern end of the government district. The Grand Mosque, which opened last year in 2023, was a massive endeavor inspired by traditional medieval Egyptian Mamluk Islamic architecture. It has a floor area of 250,000 square meters and can accommodate over 131,000 worshippers at once, making it not only Egypt's largest mosque, but also the largest mosque on the entire African continent and the largest mosque in the Middle East outside of Saudi Arabia's holiest mosques in Mecca and Medina. When completed, the Egyptian Grand Mosque set several world records, including the world's heaviest and largest chandelier. It weighs over 53,000 pounds or 24,000 kilograms and has a diameter of 72 feet or 22 meters, as well as the world's tallest pulpit, which stands about 17 meters or 55 feet. And it's not the only massive religious structure to be built in the future capital. There is also the freshly constructed Nativity of Christ Cathedral nearby, which is the largest church ever built in the Middle East. The church is a cathedral dedicated to Egypt's Coptic Orthodox population, and its location near the Grand Mosque in the new capital was purposefully chosen to symbolize peaceful cohabitation between Egypt's two main religious communities. While it is estimated that approximately 90% of Egypt's current population adheres to Sunni Islam, the remaining 10% are Coptic Orthodox Christians, making them by far Egypt's largest religious minority group, as well as the largest Christian community in the Middle East, with a population of around 11 million. The new capital core business area, located to the west of these new religious buildings in the government district, will have its own set of ambitious ambitions. Among them is the already completed iconic tower. The China State Construction Engineering Corporation assisted in the construction of the iconic tower, which stands 79 floors tall at 1,293 feet, 394 meters. The exterior shell is designed to resemble the crown worn by the ancient Egyptian god Ammon as depicted in Egyptian hieroglyphics. However, the new capital's planners are not satisfied with just being the tallest building in Africa. This megatall skyscraper, inspired by an ancient obelisk from pharaonic Egypt, is currently scheduled to have 165 stories and a total architectural height of 1,000 meters or 1 kilometer. Construction on the building is expected to begin this year in 2024, and if completed by the target completion date of 2030, it will take the title of the world's tallest structure from the current record holder, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which would only be 170 meters shorter. However, the cost of this gigantic skyscraper is expected to be at least $3.2 billion. Even that is probably a huge underestimate, and given Egypt's already substantial financial woes, it remains to be seen whether this portion of the project will be built at all. Then there's the brand new Olympic City complex within the new capital, which is being developed particularly to help Egypt compete for future bids to host major international athletic events, such as the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup. More than 22 various athletic facilities are being built within the complex, including a big new association football stadium with a seating capacity of 94,000 people, making it Africa's second largest and the world's 8th largest. Then, in Phase I's southwest corner, rises the single largest district and edifice in the entire new city, the Octagon, the new headquarters for the Egyptian Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense's new headquarters here will consist of 10 new buildings in an octagonal shape that will sprawl across an area of more than 22,000 acres, which is larger than the independent nation of San Marino, which has 34,000 people. The Octagon's floor space over these 10 towers will be approximately 50.5 million square feet under roof, making it the world's largest office structure at a military headquarters. It has roughly 8 times the floor space of the Pentagon near Washington, D.C., which serves as the headquarters for the United States Department of Defense. This is despite the fact that the United States provides 1/5 of Egypt's defense budget as a grant, and even with that grant, Egypt's defense budget is currently only the 35th largest in the world, lower than that of Belgium, which isn't exactly known for being a military powerhouse worthy of the world's largest military defense complex. In any case, the Green River Park that runs through the new capital center will connect all of these areas, symbolizing the passage of the Nile River across Egypt. The park's first phase, which is now being completed, will be 6 miles, 10 kilometers, long, making it twice the size of Central Park in New York City. And when it is fully expanded in future phases, it is scheduled to reach a nearly laughable length of 22 miles or 35 kilometers, making it roughly 6 times the size of New York Central Park by then. 8 totally residential districts will also be built along the park's perimeter, interspersed with wide streets and highways that connect to the government, economic, religious, and sports districts. Other smaller districts I didn't even mention included an entirely separate sports city, a knowledge city designed to house foreign universities, an arts and culture city, a banking district, a medical campus, an expo city for hosting major conventions, and a brand new large international airport. With all of that stuffed in here, it's easy to see how the Egyptians have already spent over $58 billion on this project. All of this comes as Egypt's national debt has reached all-time highs. Inflation has reached all-time highs. The Egyptian currency has plummeted to all-time lows, and the country is experiencing its worst economic crisis in decades. Tens of billions of dollars are being poured into this lavish new capital city. 1/3 of Egypt's population continues to live in poverty, and the country is coping with all-time high inflation and a low-valued currency. So, obviously, many people are concerned that this shiny new capital developing in the desert is adding to the country's collapse. And few believe Egypt can genuinely afford this level of extravagance in the desert, which raises the question of why the Egyptian government appears to be eager to go bankrupt to develop this vast new capital city in the first place. Officially, the Egyptian government has declared that this new administrative capital project is primarily important to relieve congestion and reduce overcrowding in Cairo, which is a major and crippling issue that the country is now working to address. Egypt's genuine shape isn't what you see on maps, because the majority of the country is occupied by the hostile Sahara Desert, which makes cultivation and life nearly impossible. Were it not for the seemingly infinite supply of water in the Nile River, which carves over this desolate country and fans out in the north across a delta region before emptying into the Mediterranean. Egypt would most certainly be as thinly populated and arid as its neighbor, Libya, which has a population of less than 7 million. But Egypt does have the Nile, which has provided life for thousands of years. It carves out the world's largest oasis, which still provides 97% of Egypt's total fresh water supply. Egypt's Nile Valley and Nile Delta regions are thus the country's genuine cores, with everything else to the west and east consisting primarily of empty deserts that serve as protective buffer zones for the core. And while the Nile River is incredibly long, it is also relatively narrow, thus the valley and delta regions combined cover about the same area as Slovakia and Europe. However, 95% of Egypt's total modern population lives in either the small valley or the small delta regions. And with a total predicted population of 107 million people in 2024, it equates to almost 102 million Egyptians squeezed into an area that is only about the same size as Slovakia or nearly similar to the combined populations of Spain and Italy. Egypt's core area within the Nile Valley and Delta is among the most densely populated and overcrowded places in the world, with an average population density of at least 2,000 people per square kilometer. If Egypt's population density was only measured within the Nile Valley and Delta, it would rank as the third most densely populated country in the world. Egypt's population has been increasing quickly for decades. 74 years ago, in 1950, Egypt's total population was slightly more than 21 million people. Since then, the country's population has increased by more than fivefold, reaching an estimated 107 million people today. The Middle East's greatest population is likely to rise even higher in the next decades. As of 2023, Egypt's fertility rate has remained significantly higher than the global average, at approximately 2.8 children per woman. Egypt's population is expected to reach 160 million by 2050, adding to the country's already overcrowded situation. The projected population density in the Nile Valley and Delta is comparable to the combined populations of California, Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. Cairo, Egypt's current capital and largest city, has nearly reached capacity, with more than 9 times its population since 1950, to the point that the city's metropolitan territory now houses more than 22.6 million people. More people than were alive in all of Egypt in 1950, making Cairo the most populous metropolis in Africa and the 5th most populous metropolis in the world. having recently surpassed Mexico City to claim the number 5 spot, and it will climb several more spots in the near future. If nothing is done, Cairo's metropolitan region is forecast to increase to roughly 38 million people by 2050, based on current projected development rates. Approximately the same population as Tokyo now. By then, Cairo will most certainly be the world's second largest metropolitan area, trailing only Mumbai, India, which is expected to become the world's largest city by that time. Cairo has now become nearly synonymous with terrible traffic and congestion, to the point where the city often hardly functions. Many of the government's most important buildings, such as the Parliament, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministerial Cabinet, the United States Embassy, the Supreme Court, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, were built around Cairo's central Tahrir Square decades or centuries ago, when the city was much smaller and less congested. Because security around and between all of these buildings is frequently required, and streets are frequently roped off, it is sometimes physically impossible to go between two different sites in the city, rendering government processes and economic activity monstrously inefficient. However, Egypt does not have a lot of open room to create new houses to attract people away from Cairo. They have extremely little accessible farmland north of Cairo in the Nile Delta or further south via the Nile Valley, preventing large-scale urban expansion in either direction. That leaves the unappealing option of extending to the east or west of Cairo into the Sahara Desert. However, because it is a less horrible choice than extending north or south and destroying valuable agricultural area, Egypt has attempted to do so for decades. The environs of Cairo are riddled with previous presidents' attempts. Residential governments in Egypt plan to create new cities to divert population away from Cairo. Like the 6th of October city to the west, the 10th of Ramadan city to the northeast, Al Eber city, and the largest project before the recent new capital project, New Cairo City, which was constructed in 2000 and now houses 1.5 million people. However, little public transportation was created to connect any of these new desert satellite settlements to Cairo, and the majority of the housing supply was reserved for the wealthy. As a result, only higher-income Egyptians with cars were able to relocate from Cairo to them. There aren't many people, therefore all of these satellite desert cities are only half occupied and have far fewer occupants than they were built for. However, Egypt's current president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, has often stated that the country's overpopulation problem is the most serious catastrophe it is now facing. In 2017, his government launched the Two is Enough campaign in Cairo, pushing Egyptian families to have only 2 children. El-Sisi has previously complimented China's famed one-child policy during talks, and he has charged his own government to cut the national fertility rate from 2.85 to 2.11 by the early 2030s. The other, more quiet and less official reason is to reduce the odds of El-Sisi and his authoritarian military regime from getting overthrown during a revolution or a coup d'etat, while simultaneously enriching himself and his supporters along the way. In addition to lowering the country's fertility rate, El-Sisi has joined a long line of Egyptian presidents in attempting to develop a new metropolis outside of Cairo to relieve the city of some of its dense population and congestion. Which is why El-Sisi's government expects that the new administrative capital project being built in the desert will eventually house 6.5 million people. However, the publicly declared reason for the entire project is to relieve Cairo's congestion and overcrowding. Hosni Mubarak, the country's longtime strongman leader, had ruled for nearly 30 years and had fallen out of favor with the majority of his people by 2011. Protesters protesting his ongoing leadership congregated in Cairo's central Tahrir Square, close to several of the Egyptian government's most key offices. And the protests grew into a full-fledged revolution, forcing Mubarak from power. The Egyptian armed forces then stepped in to temporarily take over power in the country until a democratic election could be held the following year in 2012. Mohamed Morsi, an Islamist from the Muslim Brotherhood organization, was democratically elected president of Egypt. Morsi then attempted to construct a new Islamist-leaning constitution in Egypt, sparking further indignation and resulting in renewed major protests the following year in 2013. Morsi's then Minister of Defense, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, eventually took advantage of these opportunities. Al-Sisi launched a military coup against Morsi, removing him from power by force. Then, when new elections were held in 2014, which were boycotted by all of Egypt's opposition parties, Al-Sisi was elected president. Part of what enabled protesters and revolutionaries to overthrow the Egyptian government twice, in 2011 and 2013, was their ability to mass literally millions of people in Cairo's central Tahrir Square, overwhelming the narrow streets with blockades that prevented the government from accessing or even defending its important offices nearby, forcing the government to concede to their demands. It was how al-Sisi ascended to power in Egypt in the first place, and after learning from his predecessor's mistakes, it was no surprise that within a year after gaining power with the presidency in 2014, al-Sisi revealed plans for a whole new capital city in 2015. However, by the time it is finished, there will be very little government power left in Cairo. All of the government's ministries, the parliament, and al-Sisi himself will have relocated 23 miles, 45 kilometers, east of Cairo, separating themselves from the tens of millions of ordinary Egyptians. To duplicate the successful revolutions of 2011 and 2013, millions of Egyptians would have to travel a long distance from Cairo to the new capital. And given that only roughly a fifth of Cairo's population has a car, the majority of them will have to trek by foot, which will take about 13 hours to walk across the Sahara Desert, with various military checkpoints likely to be set throughout. And to complicate any future rebellion's chances of success in the new capital even more, the new capital is being planned in such a way that any protest is as difficult as possible. All of the roads and avenues are built to be as wide as possible in order to make barricading them as difficult as possible, which is a concept shared by many other capital cities across the world. More than 6,000 security cameras are planned to be installed throughout the new capital city, which is directly inspired by Chinese government surveillance systems, and will include a similar Chinese-fashioned Central Command surveillance system that will track everything going on in the capital at all times via thousands of camera live broadcasts. The city will have little public transportation, making it difficult for people to get around, while the presence of the military's massive new headquarters at the Octagon complex will allow the entire Egyptian military to quickly deploy a crackdown on any potential threats. The new capital, once built, will firmly divide the Egyptian government and head of state from the Egyptian people, similar to a 21st century Versailles. More than 340 years ago, French King Louis XIV made a same policy decision when he moved his entire official seat of government away from Paris to his new extravagant palace in Versailles, approximately 12 miles, 19 kilometers from the center of Paris. For the next century after the relocation, Versailles served as France's de facto capital over Paris, isolating the French monarchy and administration from the people they ruled over and distancing their issues from the king. But in the end, the French government's retreat to Versailles made little impact, since the French Revolution erupted in 1789, more than a century after the move, forcing the king and government back to Paris at gunpoint, where they have remained ever since. And just as Versailles did for the French nobility and separated the government from the people, the spanking new Egyptian capital being created today directly benefits al-Sisi's regime and his military followers. When the new capital city was first announced in 2015, al-Sisi's government claimed that no Egyptian state monies would be used for its construction. Investors from the United Arab Emirates were originally supposed to fund the entire project, but that plan fell through. When Chinese investors largely backed out of the new capital project, al-Sisi's government was forced to finance the entire project with Egyptian public funds, either by taking on loans, increasing the government's debt, selling state-owned land, or directly allocating parts of the government budget to the construction itself. And after the UAE investors fell through on the new capital, the Egyptian government simply established a brand new company to oversee the capital's future construction, known as the Administrative Capital for Urban Development, or ACUD, which is interestingly owned 51% by the Egyptian military and only 49% by the Egyptian Housing Ministry. This corporation receives the majority of government contracts, to carry out the massive construction projects underway in the capital, and its financials are fully non-transparent and not subject to public auditing or independent monitoring, which is extremely handy. High-ranking members of the Egyptian military are important stockholders, suppliers, or supervisors of the ongoing construction work, and they are all certainly benefiting billions of dollars from it. And because the majority of the funding for the capital has come from Egypt's public resources, the entire new capital city project has essentially been a vast wealth transfer from the Egyptian people to Egyptian generals and El-Sisi himself. Since the insurgency in Sinai began, the Egyptian army has lost over 3,200 men, which is more than the number of U.S. forces lost in 20 years of counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan. The Sinai insurgency has been Egypt's most serious internal security problem. While many external crises have worsened Egypt's economic predicament, there was the COVID-19 epidemic, which began in 2020 and affected every country in the world. And with more than $58 billion already invested in the project, Egypt has been obliged to take on additional loans and debt to cover the costs, as crisis after crisis has wreaked havoc on the country's economy since 2015. In 2013, El-Sisi and the military toppled Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, sparking an Islamist insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula, which is huge, rugged, thinly populated, and difficult to manage. Then, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, which had a particularly strong impact on Egypt due to its wheat supplies to the country. Without enough fertile land along the narrow Nile banks to support its own increasing population development, Egypt has been obliged to import the majority of its wheat supplies from outside, making it the world's largest wheat importer. About 55% of the country's wheat supply was imported from outside. In 2022, just before the war in Ukraine began, Russia supplied over 60% of Egypt's imported wheat, with Ukraine providing another 22%. The beginning of war in Ukraine and the Black Sea caused worldwide wheat prices to jump and restricted Egypt's access to its traditional import sources, further rocking the country's economy. Then, in early 2023, a horrific civil war erupted immediately to the south of Egypt and Sudan, sending hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing north into Egypt. Then, in October 2023, another big conflict broke out on Egypt's borders in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, causing an even worse double shock to the Egyptian economy. Tourism to the country, which typically accounts for over 8% of the country's GDP and generated approximately $14 billion in revenue for Egypt in 2023, has completely collapsed in the aftermath of the catastrophic battle breaking out just next door in Gaza. At the same time, the war's repercussions have damaged Cairo's second major economic source, the Suez Canal. Egypt's canal is widely regarded as its most valuable asset, because it handles around 12% of global seaborne trade in any one year. The Egyptian government earns from this by charging tolling and fees for all trade that uses the canal. The Suez Canal generated an all-time high revenue stream of $9.4 billion for the Egyptian government for the fiscal year running from summer 2022 to summer 2023. But since then, the Houthis, an Iranian-backed movement in Yemen that controls the majority of the country's major population centers, have stated that they will begin assaulting Israeli, American, and British trade ships in the Red Sea in support of their allies Hamas in Gaza. These attacks have largely targeted merchant vessels from all around the world, and it has caused a major drop in merchant shipping via the Red Sea via the Suez Canal, causing Egypt's revenue from the Suez Canal tolls to drop by approximately half. As a result of all of these issues that have recently piled up for Egypt, as well as the government's ongoing desire to plop tens of millions of hundreds of billions of dollars into the new capital, despite them. Egypt's financial position has deteriorated to its worst point in decades, since El-Sisi formally became Egypt's president a decade ago in 2014. Egypt's external debt has quadrupled to more than $164 billion, while the total government debt, including internal debt, has risen to nearly $370 billion, accounting for roughly 93% of the country's GDP. Again, 44% of Egypt's total national debt is owed abroad. In comparison, the US national debt is currently 123% of GDP, which is more than Egypt's, but just 24% of America's national debt is owed externally, which is significantly smaller than Egypt's. Many of Egypt's external loans have come from the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, to whom it owes around $18 billion as of 2023. Egypt is currently the second largest IMF debtor in the world, trailing only Argentina. To secure many of these loans over the last few years, the Egyptian government had to weaken its currency numerous times. Since 2016, the Egyptian currency has been depreciated 5 times, with the most recent devaluation occurring just a few days before the premiere of this film. The Egyptian pound, the country's currency, has lost approximately 90% of its value in relation to the US dollar since Al-Sisi took office as president, with $1 now trading on the market for around 50 Egyptian pounds, compared to $1 for 5 Egyptian pounds in 2016. Correspondingly, these frequent and sharp devaluations in Egypt's currency, combined with unexpected price shocks to Egypt's imported resources, such as wheat and oil as a result of the war in Ukraine, have resulted in skyrocketing inflation in the country, which has peaked at 36% per year, the highest levels of inflation seen in Egypt's modern history. The cratering value of the Egyptian pound, along with the country's expanding debt, means that by 2024, the country will be spending around 60% of its entire government budget simply servicing all of its debt commitments. While construction on the glittering new capital continued, relatively few changes were made to the original concept. The plans for affordable housing in the new capital appear to have been reduced. While construction on the monorail line that was supposed to connect downtown Cairo to the new capital appears to have been halted. All of this could be a feature rather than a bug designed to further divide the wealthy Egyptians connected to the government in the new capital from the poor, everyday Egyptians left in Cairo. And as recently as December of last year, in 2023, Bloomberg experts classified Egypt as the second most likely countries in the world to fail on its debts, trailing only war-torn Ukraine in terms of default risk. There are few options for Egypt's current administration to truly get out of this crisis. The IMF has requested that al-Sisi's military-dominated administration begin to lessen its grip on the economy in order to create a climate conducive to the growth of private firms. The Egyptian military controls almost every aspect of the country's economy, including construction, tourism, food production, and pharmaceuticals. Most of Egypt's main enterprises are owned and operated by the military. The Egyptian military is often referred to as a state within Egypt. So if former general-turned-president al-Sisi were to turn on them by privatizing many of their commercial interests, they would most likely topple him and replace him with someone else. Which means that he's largely powerless to actually adopt most of the economic reforms in Egypt that organizations like the IMF have demanded. Which means he's more likely to keep being dependent on continuing the country's economic doom cycle by borrowing more money from abroad and increasing the debt to pay for servicing the previous debt, which will continue to run the currency into the ground and increase the country's inflation rate, which pisses off the Egyptian public against him even more, which increases his own personal need to have a brand new capital separate from the people who could overthrow him even further, which increases his needs to keep pouring money into finishing the new capital project, which increases his needs for acquiring more loans and starting the doom cycle all over again. It is by far the biggest economic crisis Egypt has ever faced in modern history, and for years, people have predicted Egypt's impending collapse under all of these circumstances. But far from collapsing, additional money from abroad has continued to flow into Egypt to keep the country alive and operating, despite all of its problems, because many people on the outside believe Egypt is simply too large a country to ever fall, especially now. Economically, Egypt is a minor power in the Middle East, with a GDP substantially lower than Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. The country has by far the region's greatest human population and a governmental collapse with that many people might result in immeasurable havoc. The Gulf Arab governments, led by Saudi Arabia and joined by the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait, have all been significantly geopolitically encouraged to maintain a stable administration in Egypt with whom they can work. The European Union market is a significant export destination for tens of billions of dollars of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf each year, and the quickest and most cost-effective way for all of that oil and gas to reach Europe is via the Suez Canal through Egypt. Without the Suez Canal, the Persian Gulf governments would lose huge amounts of money by transferring their oil and gas exports to Europe via a lengthy route around Africa. As a result, they require a compliant and stable Egyptian government that will continue to allow them to use the canal at a low cost. This is a major reason why Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait grew concerned about Egypt's leadership in 2012, after Islamist Mohammed Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood took power in the country following the chaos of the 2011 revolution. The Muslim Brotherhood, like most political Islamist movements, advocates for the supremacy of the Islamic faith and government over what they see as secular man-made monarchies, such as Saudi Arabia, which is why the Saudis and Bahrain see the Brotherhood as a major direct threat to their own monarchical rule, and why most of them have gone so far as to officially designate the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. You see, there's a sort of Cold War going on across the Middle East, between the monarchist Gulf Arab powers on one side, led by the Saudis and Emiratis, who are opposed to political Islamist movements like the Brotherhood, and on the other side, countries that openly support political Islamist movements in the region, led by the Brotherhood, which came to power in Egypt in 2012. Turkey and Qatar were both overjoyed, but Saudis and Emiratis were afraid. The Saudis, Emiratis, and Kuwaitis all supported Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's military coup that deposed Egypt's Brotherhood administration in 2013. They did not want Egypt to join their political Islamist opponents. Egypt's military-dominated administration has stayed solidly aligned with the anti-Islamist faction ever since. To maintain the country's stability in the face of massive recent economic problems, the Gulf Arab states invested more than $34 billion in Egypt between 2013 and 2022 in the form of outright grants, oil shipments, and, in some cases, effectively buying parts of Egypt's territory. In 2016, al-Sisi's government made the highly controversial decision to legally cede two of Egypt's most strategically located islands to the Saudis in exchange for continued Saudi aid and investment in his own megaprojects, such as the new capital. The two uninhabited islands, Tiran and Sanafir, are strategically vital because they control access through the Tiran Straits, which are the only maritime corridor that ships may take from Israel's port of Eilat or Jordan's port of Aqaba into the Red Sea and the global ocean. Saudi Arabia has revealed plans to transform Tiran and Sanafir into a new global tourism hub, complete with a new bridge that will connect Saudi Arabia and Egypt directly for the first time in history. The two uninhabited islands, Tiran and Sanafir, are strategically vital because they control access through the Tiran Straits, which are the only maritime corridor that ships may take from Israel's port of Eilat or Jordan's port of Aqaba into the Red Sea and the global ocean. Saudi Arabia has revealed plans to transform Tiran and Sanafir into a new global tourism hub, complete with a new bridge that will connect Saudi Arabia and Egypt directly for the first time in history. However, Saudi Arabia's ownership of the islands will strengthen its strategic importance in the Red Sea region, as well as their influence over Israel and Jordan. And the Saudis aren't the only ones buying strategically significant land in Egypt to help fund the government and keep it from crumbling. In March 2024, just as I was filming this video, the United Arab Emirates announced that they would invest a truly massive $35 billion in Egypt for the exclusive rights to develop multiple new projects in the country, including $24 billion for the Emirates' exclusive rights to develop the Ras Al Hekma area on a cape on the Egyptian Mediterranean shoreline, approximately 200 kilometers west of Egypt's second largest city, Alexandria. The Emirates now intend to develop this area into a large new Mediterranean beach resort town from which they hope to profit in the future. While the injection of so much Emirati cash into Egypt's fragile economy most likely saved the government from defaulting this year and risking a catastrophic new crisis, it also constitutes the single greatest foreign investment in Egypt's history. And it is more money than the Gulf states jointly put into Egypt for a day in the decade between 2013 and 2022, which may indicate how terrible Egypt's economic condition has grown. The Emirati cash for Egyptian assets, such as Ras Al Hekma, isn't the only money the country has recently received. Egypt's stability is also essential to the European Union, as it is one of the key entry points for refugees and migrants into southern European countries, such as Greece. So, rather than seeing the country's economy collapse and the instability that would result, the EU has lately floated the notion of an $8 billion rescue package for Egypt as well. And Egypt's stability is extremely essential to the United States. Egypt, after all, was the first Arab country to make peace with Israel and recognize the Jewish state in 1979. Since then, Washington has worked to turn Egypt's early recognition of Israel's existence into a model for the rest of the Arab world to emulate, by basically paying Egypt as much as possible for what it has done. In 1989, Washington formally categorized Egypt and Israel as key non-NATO allies. Since then, each has served as the foundation of Washington's military strategy and presence in the Middle East. Since establishing peace with Israel in 1979, Egypt has been the world's second largest beneficiary of U.S. foreign aid after Israel, and a stunning $51 billion in U.S. foreign aid to Egypt has been military aid. Since 1985, all U.S. military aid to Egypt has been considered donations that have never had to be repaid. Since then, Washington has consistently provided Egypt with approximately $1.3 billion in military aid on a yearly basis. Egypt's willingness to cooperate with Israel, as well as its possession of the Suez Canal, make it a highly important partner to Washington because the canal enables American warships, including aircraft carriers, to rapidly redeploy between the Mediterranean theater and the Indo-Pacific, allowing American warships to quickly move between threats posed by states like Russia, Syria, or Libya in the Mediterranean, and threats posed by states like Iran and their proxies like. Furthermore, the Suez Canal provides the quickest trade route for Persian Gulf oil and gas to reach America's NATO allies in Europe, which has become even more important since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as European NATO allies have increased their reliance on Persian Gulf oil and gas in place of Russian oil and gas. Egypt's stability became even more vital to Washington following the commencement of war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza on October 7th. Egypt holds the only border with Gaza that is not controlled by Israel, and with the war still raging there, as well as other potential crises in Lebanon, the Red Sea, and Iran, Washington does not want Egypt to collapse into a revolution again. With an unpredictable incoming leadership, this might exacerbate the region's already raging fire. As a result, Washington has been incentivized to continue supplying Egypt with significant foreign aid. To Washington, as well as the Israelis and Gulf monarchs, El-Sisi may be an autocratic tyrant who is squandering tens of billions of dollars on an economically damaging, brand new capital city in the desert, while his country's economy falls and his people get impoverished. However, he is also predictable, dependable, and most importantly, friendly to them in a part of the world where geopolitics, bloodshed, and instability are nearly synonymous. They can also take advantage of Egypt's need for cash by purchasing some of its assets along the route at bargain basement prices. Egypt's size on the map, combined with its massive population, makes it simply too large for any of El-Sisi's outside allies to ever allow it to fail, allowing El-Sisi and the Egyptian military to continue borrowing money from them or selling assets to them to stay afloat. But it's all a delicate house of cards, and Egypt's foreign backers may someday lose patience or decide that the expense of preserving Egypt's stability is no longer worth the high price. Egypt's new capital emerging in the desert represents this international equation, which weighs Egypt's geopolitical worth against a seemingly limitless money pit. As long as the equation favors Egypt, building on megaprojects in the new capital is expected to continue. However, if the calculus flips and Egypt's foreign allies cease bringing in more money, Egypt's new administrative capital may be tried by the Egyptian people in the same manner that Versailles was tested by the French people over 235 years ago. Producing these types of videos now requires a large amount of data. Whether it's demonstrating how Egypt's proposed megatall skyscraper will stack up against the Burj Khalifa, how Egypt's new military headquarters at the Octagon compares to the sovereign country of San Marino, Egypt's population density pattern, or why Saudi Arabia wanted to buy these islands from Egypt. Thanks for watching this video till the end. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and a sub so more people can see this. We'll see you in another video.